Hi, everybody. Welcome to this fourth webinar of the European Society for Rural Sociology series. As I said, this is the fourth. We have conducted three previously around a variety of themes, and you can find the recording of those on the website of the Society and also on the YouTube channel of the ESRS, as this one will be available too. Today's theme is seasonal workers and permanent precarity, migrant labor in Mediterranean agriculture. We have with us today as invited speakers Apostolos, Papadopoulos, and Deniz, Pelek. I will be introducing each one of them in due time. I just would like to tell you that very briefly that the structure of this webinar will follow a 10-minute presentation by each of our guest speakers today. And then we will have around 20 minutes for sort of a conversational segment in which they can debate with each other, they can ask questions to each other. I may have also some prompts to create a dynamic debate. And then we will have time for a Q&A, and that's it. So without further ado, because we have lost enough time, unfortunately, I will be introducing Apostolos first and then giving the floor for his presentation. Professor Apostolos Papadopoulos is a professor of rural sociology and geography at Harokopio University of Athens. His research spans rural change, labor migration and integration, mobilities, spatial justice and agri-food systems. He has coordinated multiple EU-funded research projects and is editor-in-chief of Sociologia Ruralis. His recent work includes multi-sited studies on migrant labor trajectories in Mediterranean agriculture, exploring intersections of precarity, ethnic hierarchies, and rural well-being in Greece. Apostolos, welcome once again. Thank you so much for having accepted our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, José, for the invitation. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be participating in this webinar. It's a pleasure to talk about the things that bother me for quite some time, and also have the opportunity to discuss with Deniz and the other participants some of the ideas. So I will share my screen. Please let me know if it's possible to see the screen.
It is. We can see it now.
Okay. Okay. I hope it's possible for everyone to follow. So I've adopted a rather provocative title, repositioning the seasonal in labor migration, hierarchies, precarity, and mobility as agency, and I will explain myself soon. I hope I'm going to the next slide. So today's topic reflects my perspective on seasonal migration, the context of labor migration in agriculture, and especially in the Mediterranean context. I aim with this presentation to disentangle labor migration from being approached as an urban phenomenon and its presence in agriculture as an extension of the urban discussion in rural areas. I'm opposed to this understanding of migration, to see migration in rural areas as an extension of the urban discussion. There is a lot of work since the early 2000s on international migration to rural areas, and in which it has emerged as a major research field in the study of migrant labor in non-urban, peripheral agriculture and all remote regions. And there is an extensive literature on international migration to rural areas. Central to the discussions of migrant labor are also places, labor markets, and local societies, which are often migrants and policies and state policies. So my intention is to reposition the seasonal element in labor migration in agriculture by addressing the hierarchies, the precarity, and also the close relations between mobility and migrant agency. So just a slide about the general context. And I'm using the notion of migration dynamics to set my main assumptions. Let me say thus a few things about migration dynamics. There are significant challenges in understanding the individual, the relational, the structural and cultural factors that shape migration dynamics. All of them have an impact on the migration dynamics, and also have an impact on the placement of migrants in destination areas, never mind if they are urban or rural. So the act of movement, or the different acts of movements of the different people who move, presuppose also immobility, anchoring, and inertia. And also we have sometimes the slow or the fast movement of migrants and or refugees, which are significant aspects of these of the movements in general. So the decisions and trajectories of migration are strongly influenced by institutional arrangements. It's very well known, the exit option against the lack of voice. And also there's a long discussion among the migration scholars on the complexity of migration decisions and dynamics, which is very much discussed. So as we research migration and migrants, we encounter various configurations and understandings of the spatialities and temporalities of migration. So my takeaway message for the time being is to be attentive to the socio-spatial, socio-temporal, aspects of migration. And having said that, I will turn my discussion to the labor migration and the rural, going straight to the main aspect of my presentation, main domain of the presentation. I'm referring to the Mediterranean setting, and we need to keep in mind when we talk about the Mediterranean, the socio-spatial aspects of the region, all of the places within the Mediterranean, which conflate different features, different geographical characteristics, different cultures, and different types of movements. So we have to see the different reflections, the connections, and the subjectivities, of course, always coupled with this region as a geopolitical region. And also, on the other hand, we have the fragmented rurality, a rurality which is fragmented, not a unified rurality, fragmented. And we have low intensity agriculture by and large, with pockets of intensive agriculture. And we also have in the Mediterranean context a close interconnection between urban and rural areas. Histories old interconnection between urban and rural areas, which differs a lot from other regions in Europe. So based on the discussion, on the previous discussion, the already done discussion about migrant labor in Mediterranean agriculture, I want to point out two interrelated aspects. One is the permanent versus seasonal employment in agriculture, which offers an axis around which researchers explore divisions and hierarchies among migrant laborers, which means some people work permanently, some migrant laborers work permanently in agriculture, a smaller proportion, and the larger proportion work seasonally. And you have a lot of people who move around the different places and work in agriculture and sometimes combine agricultural and non-agricultural activities. And the second aspect is closely connected to the first one, is the socio-spatial mobility trajectories of migrants. People move around space. They don't move particularly, sometimes they don't choose to move particularly upon urban spaces. Sometimes they choose for rural spaces to move around and interchange between the two. So, again, from things from the literature already existing on labor migration in rural areas in the Mediterranean, we have in a paper and a chapter written long ago with, not recently, not long ago, with Lucia Maria Fracea, we found two main strands in this literature. The first strand emphasizes the key role of migrant labor in intensive agriculture. And in these cases, the agriculture, the specialized agriculture, the export-oriented agricultural production is stressed, and then it's connected to the existence or to the availability of seasonal migrant labor. And this seasonal migrant labor is, in most of the cases, if not all the cases, is actually controlled by the big agribusiness, who try their best to keep them around irregularly, as irregulars, as a controlling mechanism to work in the fields. So this approach focuses on seasonal labor and analyzes different forms of precarity, ethnic hierarchies, racialization, manipulation, and exploitation. So this is a whole production regime, so to say, which combines well with the whole discussion on how labor migration connects to intensive agriculture. And sometimes this is presented as a nexus between agriculture and migration. This strand is prominent in recent years. It was prominent in the last decades, and is still prominent because it illustrates the global factors and the local factors which are involved in the Mediterranean agriculture and link Mediterranean agriculture to the international agri-food markets. The second strand is the one which highlights the multifunctionality of migrant labor in Mediterranean rural areas, and is the one which links the socio-spatial and agricultural characteristics of these regions. In short, there is work which tries to connect the migrant labor with the difficulties of rural areas to attract laborers, having to do with the demographic issues in rural areas, also having to do with the gaps in the labor market of the more, not very many people are available to work in agriculture because everybody is moving upward in terms of the local population and so on and so forth. So this migrant labor is considered in many cases from the perspectives of both the host places and the migrants' needs, expectations, and aspirations. And this strand focuses on the interactions between the receiving rural society and the migrants. And also this second strand shows that migrants have agency and they aim for their well-being, along with the well-being of the locals, not at the same time, of course, as an interaction between the two. And now comes the repositioning of the season and the labor migration. If I have to choose between the two, I would say both are important, but the second one is rather more important for the reasons I'm going to explain. It is important to reposition seasonal labor within the broader discussion of labor migration and agriculture in rural areas, which requires to integrate the topic of seasonal labor migration in the wider context of migrant labor in rural and agricultural settings. So we need a broader perspective in order to better understand the mechanisms of migrant emplacement in rural regions. Sometimes a seasonal migration, seasonal labor is perceived as a non-emplacement, as people who are not actually integrated. But this is, I think, one part of the story. Focusing exclusively on the relationship between intensive agriculture, seasonal migration, precarity, and exploitation as the main approach in rural areas implies that agriculture is the defining feature of the rural. While we know from rural sociology and the former work that we have to distinguish analytically between agriculture and rurality as relatively distinct research domains and try to find their interconnections. What can be called, in the Weberian terms, iron cage of industrial or intensive agriculture, which of course, certainly in reality racializes and instrumentalizes seasonal migrants and frames seasonal labor as a policy paradigm, is not the sole lens through which migrant displacement in rural contexts is perceived and understood. We need to move beyond treating seasonal labor as a legitimate concept and try to, as we say in the migration studies, in migration literature, to demigrantize, I would say to de-seasonalize migrant labor. And I will explain myself. I already explained many things, but we have to take into account that seasonality is a pervasive feature of the Mediterranean context. And also there are interconnections of seasonality with permanent employment. People jump from seasonal, not the whole number, but the smaller number jump to permanent employment, to circular employment, to pluriactivity. So we have to see the interconnections between all of them. And we need to analyze seasonal labor through the lenses also of transnationalism. Migrants are transnational subjects, the mobilities, the infrastructures, the corridors, and the temporalities, to better understand its dynamics in rural contexts. So not the whole of the rural is condemned to seasonal labor. That's my view. There was, of course, a significant delay before researchers began investigating the impact of migrant labor in rural areas. And of course, migrant employment in agriculture between different sectors and across urban-rural divide remain important in the Mediterranean context. So migrant placement needs to be in our focus in rural areas, which requires the research at different scales, places, and temporalities. And a slide for my concluding remarks in order not to take more of your time and leave most of a lot of the things to discuss later on. So addressing seasonal labor as within a range of employment positions helps to avoid normative interpretations of migration and migrant employment in agriculture, while also overcoming the structuralist agency dilemma. In many cases, seasonal laborers are presented as passive subjects in this discussion, which have to vote with their feet to leave the place in order to be liberated. Closer attention to migrant mobilities in relation to agricultural production rationalities and government policies allows for a better understanding of migrant repertoires of resilience or well-being and their agency at large. What we want to stress is that it's migrants' agency against all odds or aside from the odds. More comparative research, in my opinion, is needed on seasonal labor agreements across different countries and contexts to identify ways to deconstruct and delegitimize their influence on policymakers and the wider public. Seasonal labor agreements are considered as a remedy for the problem. And finally, seasonal labor has been integral to the social and spatial trajectories of migrants in their broader pursuit of well-being. Therefore, we need improved interpretations of migrant aspirations, experiences, and actions from various time, space perspectives in order to understand what is going on in the rural areas. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Apostolos, and I'm sure you gave us a lot of food for the discussion. And without further ado, also I will pass to present Deniz, and then give her the floor for her presentation before we move into the debate. Deniz Pelek is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Izmir Democracy University. She has worked as a postdoctoral researcher on the Migrant project funded by the European Research Council at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona from 2020 to 2023. She's currently an affiliated researcher in the Transnational Relations, Democratization and Migration Transdem Research Group at the same university in Barcelona. And her research interests and publications in several international outlets like the Journal of Peasant Studies are critical agrarian studies, migration, and refugee studies. Deniz, to you as well, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, José, for inviting me. Thank you for this kind invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and it's a privilege to share this panel with Apostolos Papadopoulos. I read him a lot during my PhD. My thesis was about seasonal agricultural workers. I really learned a lot about the Greek case from his articles. Now sharing the panel with him is really a pleasure and privilege for me. Thank you very much. Now I'll share my screen. Okay. So sorry, my presentation will be based on 3 papers. One of them is about rural ghettos. The other one is about ethnic hierarchy between seasonal agricultural workers, but it will be based on mostly the case of Syrian refugees. And the third one is about the relation between immobility and environmental vulnerabilities of seasonal agricultural workers in disaster-affected areas of Turkey. So with these publications, I am trying to challenge with the term seasonality that is established in the literature, in the legal legislations as well, because those workers are usually defined as the term seasonal, that refers to seasonal time of the work and seasonal time of the residence. But here I want to emphasize the year-round residence in tents, in temporary tents, but the permanent residence in those tents, and the settlement of permanent tents as neighborhoods, and the infrastructure, basic services in those residence areas. These photos are from my field work. Those tent areas are usually located in the very close to the river or the drainage of the water. And those are, as you see, seen as temporary, but they turn to as permanent in some locations of Turkey, in the southern Turkey. I should also say that, of course, there are temporary tents, but the new phenomenon is the emergence of those permanent tent neighborhoods. So why this new phenomenon occurred? One of the reasons is the economic. By the effect of neoliberalization of the agriculture, and there is an increasing global market in Turkey and in Mediterranean, of course, as well, especially after 1990s and after 2000. And following the withdrawal of state support, producers converge their lands to more alternative crops, like high-value crops. And in the south of Turkey, in Adana and Mersin cities, there is a transition from cotton to high-value citrus production and greenhouse crops. And especially, I interviewed with both workers and labor intermediaries and the producers. And I asked the producers, do you prefer using a machine or workers? They always actually say that they want to use the machine. And the mechanized cotton harvest was available in 2000, but they had to change their crop to manual, to the crops where the manual labor is needed because of the cost of, because of the prices in the market. And now there are like citrus, like lemon or orange, and this kind of like citrus production is common. And this production need labor for a long time. More precariously, for example, a group of workers can work in winter months, in February, in citrus production. Then they are unemployed, let's say, for 2 weeks. And then they are employed again for 4 weeks. And then they are unemployed again. That was not possible when the cotton was the main crop there, because the cotton production need labor, let's say, 4 months. But here there is more precarious circle, and so there is always need for labor throughout the year. And the other reason is political. There is an influx of Syrian refugees since 2011 to Turkey, and those refugees are in need for accommodation and work. And state couldn't provide accommodation in urban areas and work in urban areas. And the solution of staying in tents permanently is kind of is quite in quite bad work and accommodation conditions, but it is still a solution for accommodation and work of the Syrian refugees. And those the effects of neoliberalization of the agriculture is also felt in the eastern and southeastern regions of Turkey, where mostly Kurdish population are staying. And there is a depeasantization process there because the convergence of land, transition from one crop to another, more high value crop, is not possible in these regions because the land is not that fertile, and there is also water problem there. That is why they couldn't convert their lands like producers in the south of Turkey did from cotton to citrus. They couldn't do that in the eastern and southeastern regions. And they turned to be a seasonal worker, and they are in constant need for accommodation and work, and the extreme poverty levels of Kurdish workers force them to stay in tents permanently rather than going back to their villages. I conceptualize rural ghetto, I am using the 3 criteria of Vakant. One of them is poverty. The residents of the inhabitants of the in these places should show like higher levels of poverty, and also there should be lack of infrastructure in those areas, and ethnically so-called like marginal groups should stay there, and those places should be located like physically segregated regions. And if you focus on the permanent tent neighborhoods in Turkey, there is a spatial segregation. Those tent neighborhoods are located in remote settlements, and they are usually located in state-owned lands that's close to water canals. And they are usually far from urban as well as village centers. And there is a lack of infrastructure in terms of clean water, electricity, and formal housing, of course. And inhabitants include Kurdish workers who are both economic migrants and IDPs, and also Syrian refugees. Both groups can be termed as ethnically marginal groups. So there is an ethnic clustering, poverty, and physical segregation. That is why I call these permanent tent neighborhoods as rural ghetto in my paper. And if you focus on the ethnic hierarchy between workers, the top is for local Turkish workers who are Turkish citizens. They usually migrate to close by villages or cities in order to have extra income, and they are not staying in tents. Usually producers are allocating some rooms or houses, extra houses for those workers. And they usually have the higher amount of wage for the same job comparing to other workers. In the middle, immigrants, the Georgians are there. They are coming from Georgia to Turkey with tourist visas for 3 months. They are not staying in tents again. They rent rooms. They are earning lower than local Turkish workers, but higher than Kurdish workers and Syrian refugees. They are trying to like saving money and going back there. They have also other temporary jobs in Georgia as well. And Kurdish economic migrants and Kurdish IDPs are Turkish citizens. They usually stay in tents, in ghettos, in permanent tents or temporary tents. They are earning lower wages comparing to local Turkish workers and immigrants from Georgia. They are usually show like chronic poverty. They are usually dispossessed workers. They don't have any pilot of land. Syrian refugees are under temporary protection. They usually stay in tents permanently in rural ghettos. They earn the lowest wages comparing to other workers for the same job. Their primary aim, primary motivation to work is the fear of deportation and fear of violence and war. So there is a like clear ethnic hierarchy between workers in the labor market. How we can understand this situation? Is it a refugeization of the labor force or poverty in turn? So there is that clear ethnic hierarchy. Syrian refugees now occupy the lowest rank below Kurdish migrants. There is a wage disparity. Syrians sometimes work only for food, not earning wage. Dayıbaşı, labor intermediary play an important role. This is the critical gatekeeper for the jobs because they are the contact person between workers and the producers. And they select the workers and they receive the money from the producer, and they usually take his commission from that money. It's 10% for Kurdish workers, but for Syrian refugees, sometimes it is 50%, and sometimes they are working only for food. And they also like their role is functional. The role of intermediary is functional. They provide tents to workers, and also they solve the problem of language for Syrian refugees. Why Syrians have these bad working conditions? Like the main theoretical approach in the literature is push and pull factor theory in migration studies. But I think this is not explaining the case because there is no really like pulling situation in working and accommodation. But here, maybe the frame of reference is more important to explain the case. They compare the like slow violence of the rural ghetto. They are exposed to like bad environmental and working condition and socioeconomic condition. They are comparing this situation to the sudden violence of the war and violence in Syria. So here, I think there is a dimension of psychology. We need to think this in critical agrarian studies and also migration studies. Emotional trauma acts as a mechanism for labor discipline here. And here I want to continue with intersecting vulnerabilities, and I will focus on two environmental events, flash floods and earthquakes, briefly. Sudden flows like expose the ongoing slow violence of the structural neglect. Like slow violence, as Rob Nixon says in his book, refers to like slow and invisible forms of violence in bad situation. It can be like exposure to the pesticides, like negative consequences of the climate change, or like the ongoing psychological and economic conditions of the war and violence. But the sudden violence is a sudden one, like sudden flash flood, sudden earthquake, sudden war. So here, this kind of like intersection of two types of violence and the consequences of the slow violence make workers more vulnerable to. In Adana in 2020, 15,000 people were affected, and their tents that's close by to the drainage canal were destroyed. In order to recover the losses, children work more hours in these post-disaster areas. If you focus the disaster and following the earthquake in 2023, like workers stay in tents again, but in our field work, they said that this is our normal. We were already staying in the tents. And the literature says us, if there is a labor shortage, wages should be higher, right? But we observed that wages remain the lowest in that region. So in order to recover the losses, women took on increased agricultural work because men moved to debris clearing. So the seasonal workers play the involuntary rescue role in these trapped populations. So they are trapped because in order to have the aid, Syrian refugees should stay there, and there is an expiration of permits. And then here labor play a kind of a recovery role. Their continued presence in rural ghettos facilitated agricultural recovery of the region. So, like as a final remark, refugees and IDPs cannot afford to flee and lack the legal permit to relocate. They are physically trapped in disaster zones. And so, but this permanent population guarantee clear the debris with the labor from rural ghettos and also harvest the crops. The old understanding was to see those workers as temporary victims because their vulnerability is seen as unfortunate accident of a certain circumstances, for example, a temporary war. But the new understanding requires to think immobility is necessary for agricultural production under slow and sudden violence. And here the rural ghetto is a highly efficient labor reserve holding place for managing the market and environmental shocks. Here I am stopped.
Thank you so much, Deniz, for the comprehensive presentation, full with the examples too. I will just, because we also started late, unfortunately, that the initial technical problem, I'll just kick off quickly a shorter section of debate between you two, and then after that we can open the floor for Q&A. So I was listening very attentively both of your presentations, and I found, at least this is how I took it, I found this sort of common dimension that cuts across and cuts transversely both your presentations, which is this challenging this notion of this dimension of temporality, right? So on right now on your presentation, Deniz, you mentioned different aspects of a permanence, of a precarity or precarious condition that challenge the nature of the seasonality, right? That's something that is seasonal, that passes, that comes and goes. But you see that but you show that with this concept of rural ghettos that there's a permanence in the precarity. And Apostolos, in your presentation, you also took on this effort to challenge this notion of how we approach seasonality. You call it repositioning ourselves to the notion of seasonality. You said, and I quote, that you refuse this idea that the whole of the rural is condemned to seasonal migrant labor. So I would like to ask you, based on this notion of this dimension of temporality, of permanence, of precarious, so this sort of contradiction between the two, what are the implications of how we take on the dimension of temporality for how we theorized seasonal labor? Apostolos, maybe we start with you.
Thank you. I should say that I very much enjoyed Deniz's presentation because I think that she revealed a lot of the whole discussion on how these migrant laboring populations in rural areas are exposed not only to agriculture but also to other major or minor events, physical or human-induced, and so showing the precariousness of their living in rural areas. So I think it's very important to connect all of these domains, and not to see only the employment aspect, but also the living conditions aspect, and so on and so forth. So when I started my presentation, I said that I'm provocative in the sense of reframing the poor migrant situation condition to say that this is a wider, we should see more generally the situation of migrant laborers in rural areas and not see them only as labor hands. Of course, I had in mind mostly single men or single women rather than families. In the case of Turkey, one can see refugee populations in this situation, families, which has to do with their own with their status in the country, with a specific, I would say, vulnerable status in the country, in each country that they are moving or forced to move. So my own thinking about that is that once we see that in the time perspective, not seeing them only in the situation of emergency, we can see different things. In the Greek case or in the other cases across the southern European agricultural areas, one can see that migrants, single migrants, in most of the cases, try to move upwards, change the sector, work in other job positions in the non-agricultural sectors if they can do it, if they can jump scales, and if they can jump sectors. And that's an important issue to be understood. So, and in many cases, they are, seasonality is the first step towards being introduced into Europe, as in the Greek case or the Italian case. So, if we, and I will stop, when I make this comment, I will stop and leave the time for Deniz to reply. What I want to say is to see seasonal labor not per se as an issue, but look at the other arrangements around seasonal labor. And we need also to understand that seasonal labor is a first step for those irregulars who come into the countries who need them as far as the labor market is concerned. And it's not connected mostly with their aspirations, with their long-term aspirations, but with their short-term aspirations. And I think we should also get rid of this instrumentality of seasonal labor, which is their chance to be gaining access to a different labor market. In many cases, I want to say it's not sustainable. They cannot stay for many years. And the whole system is based on the fact that people move upwards. Some of them will move upwards. The others will move around. Another percentage will move further. And new people will come. And now what is going on in Europe is that this system doesn't work anymore because there are not anymore large numbers coming in to fill the lower levels of this scale. And this shows that there is a problematic situation which is based on the prerequisite that seasonal migration is a cornerstone of this labor market inclusion of migrants, which is very, I would say, very futile and a contradiction in terms. So I think it's not the solution. The way for rural areas is to include and try to keep people in rural areas. Never mind if they are co-ethnics or different ethnicities. And this is an issue also for the resilience and the well-being in rural areas. And of course, What I'm talking about is about the European cases, the Greek, the Italian, and the Spanish mostly cases. Thank you.
Deniz, go ahead, please.
Thank you. When I wrote this part of my thesis and this paper about rural ghettos, I am inspired by the case of Italy, because there were some neighborhoods there, and I learned from the literature, transit migrants are staying there permanently, but they don't have any legal papers, and they had to work in agriculture. And then I realized better the case of Turkey. Actually, this is the case of those buffer zones, maybe, and also the case of Global South, since the 85% of people who are flee from the internal war and violence are staying in the Global South countries. We may see these permanent settlements in rural areas more in the near future. I think so. The one implication for your question, José, maybe is the geography is important. Maybe is geographical. So we need to redefine this. So why this is not occurring in urban areas? Because the urban areas are kind of limited here. Like they are excluding those migrants to rural areas. That is why I think we may see more permanency in rural areas, I think. So there is a neoliberal crop transition. I explained the case of Turkey by focusing on the south of Turkey, but this is occurring in the other European countries as well, like in Italy, in Greece. So the preference of the producers is usually high value crops. These are usually labor intensive crops. That is why they need those migrant labor. So we will, I think, see that this will be more common in the near future. And rural ghetto, like this permanency of the labor here, is an important labor reserve. This reserve army of labor that makes agriculture production is possible. And here, ethnicized labor market is necessary in order to reduce the labor costs here. It is quite ethnic antagonism there is quite functional for the global agricultural labor market. And so informality is necessary in order to sustain ethnicized labor markets, because it's, for example, in urban areas, it's almost impossible to give the different wages for the same job. But here, for the same job, the wages are different for just based on the ethnic group or ethnic identity of those workers. And thanks to this, the wages are lower here. And forced displacement, like emotional discipline, like fear of death and violence, is important factors behind this permanency of the cheap labor army here. That is important. So in terms of theorizing seasonal labor, so if we see that there is a permanent population there, but their residence is kind of located far from the villages. And now a rural area, both for legislation and literature, it is more than the sum of the villages. So it was the sum of the villages before. But here is more than some of the villages. So we need to redefine the rural space, I think. So it means first the literature should see that, and the second, state authorities should provide some basic services to these areas beyond the villages. That is an important implication, I think. In terms of space, in terms of the political and economic legislations, if we accept, yes, there is a permanent population, there is a need for new labor legislation to provide more fair conditions to those workers.
Thank you, Deniz.
José, can I add something
sure.
to what I said already? I think I refer to the Italian, the Greek, and the Spanish case. All of them are different between them. There are differences. Just to mention the issue of refugees, the people with refugee status. I don't differentiate them from migrants. I consider them to be the same group as a whole. But the people who have a refugee or they are after refugee status, in the Greek case, there were relocations of those people, government relocations of people, and they were not given the formal right to work in agriculture. Only they could work informally. The recording. Okay. So there is a spatial situation. I mean, differs between places in Greece. So, but it was not a state policy to relocate them to rural areas to work in agriculture. There were attempts to do that, but they were not successful. In the Italian case, though, which is different, there is a policy to keep them in rural areas for a certain period of time. And especially in the south. So in the Greek case, there isn't such policy, so an important policy. So if I understand from the case of Turkey, there is a policy to keep them out of the cities or to keep them in groups in specific places. So it's not. So I think in order to reframe the issue, it's not seasonal migration which is the issue. It's the relocation policy, the policy of the countries to keep them available for seasonal work. If we consider them as seasonal laborers, we miss the point. That was the point of my presentation. Whereas seasonal employment is very important for the crops in agriculture. We cannot name people after seasonal work and consider them as a specific group of people who have special needs. I mean, what I'm saying actually is migrant populations as a whole need a better understanding, not seasonal workers. In the Turkish cases, groups of people who are together with their families. The thing is different in other European countries, and in the case of Spain, where due to bilateral agreements, a lot of women come and work as seasonal workers from Morocco. It's a different case. We have a feminization of seasonal labor there, but it is an intended consequence due to the existing bilateral agreements. In the Italian and the Greek case, and I have data to support that, there's mostly 85% males who work in agriculture, and they are considered to be the significant labor force behind that. And of course, irregularity is a condition which is a control mechanism of people to remain in rural areas and work in agriculture as a whole, not only seasonally, to do all the manual and unskilled work and be a labor force for the rural areas where they cannot find any other group to work in rural areas. So there is the manipulation, the government manipulation, or the overall regulation leads to this instrumentalization of migrant labor as seasonal. Whereas I think another approach is needed to understand it as a whole, the whole issue, and understand the aspect of seasonal migration as part of the discussion in rural areas. I stop here.
Thank you, Apostolos. And I think, if we had the time, I really would like to pursue on this debate, but I need to be fair to the participants here, and I need to open the floor for Q&A. So I think we have one. Yes, yeah. Please go ahead. I think we cannot hear you. I think you might be muted or something, but we can't hear you now.
I hope you can hear me now.
Now, yes, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Ngubane from Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. Thanks to both presenters for very clear and well-researched presentations. I just have one question regarding children and child labor. What have been the long-term implications for the children, especially given the context that many of them might have been there for some time, and they obviously grow up, and what happens to the children over time, maybe what has happened to them over the past maybe 20-year period, and what generally happens with regards to their futures, and also what have been your observations specifically with regards to unpaid child labor? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. Maybe we can collect one or two more, so we do a round and then we give the floor. Are there more questions for this first round? No? Okay, so perhaps I give you more time to think on your questions. I hope you have questions after. And Deniz, would you like to start and answer this question about implications for child labor, unpaid child labor, and children in general? Yeah.
Sure. When I think and write about rural ghettos, I don't see those people as kind of like passive victims of one situation. I think they do have agency to change the situation. Staying permanently in tents is yes, of course, is outcome of certain situation, but also it is a choice of the workers. Because if they stay there, the children, for example, can go to school by school service. And of course, when they go back, they may have to work in agricultural field as well. But if we think only Kurdish migrants from Turkey, if they go back to their villages in eastern regions, they usually miss the school period in September, October, May. So like the school performance, of course, being affected from the situation. But if they stay in tents, they may follow the school in south of Turkey. And in the long run, there may be upward mobility situation based on the school performance. If those children become a doctor, nurse, or like teacher, etc., of course the well-being of the household can change. That is why they usually prefer to send their children to school. Of course, like expecting the same school performance, like success from those students is not fair because they are living in quite bad situation, but it is still a possibility for them, I think. For the question for unpaid child labor, so there are two types of wage system. One of them is based on like daily wage. In that system, children usually are not working. They are kind of like like playing and like spending time in the field and in the tent area as well, but they are not working. If it is the box system, like you are earning the wage based on the total box, usually like all family members are working and children are helping to their parents. And this is of course unpaid. It goes to the father of the household.
Apostolos, do you have any inputs on this question too?
Yes, I will be very fast in order to allow for other questions. I think they, I should say that in the Greek case, the recent situation is that a lot of seasonal or not seasonal migrant laborers come from Asia, from Pakistan and Bangladesh, and some people from also from Northern Africa and other countries outside Europe. But still, a significant number of people who work in agriculture come from Albania, and in cases that they were in Greece in rural areas and staying in Greece in rural areas, most of them regular migrants with their children may have helped them in the past in the fields, but not as labor force. And they tried and they succeeded in many cases, their children to be moving towards other professions. I mean, when you have the second generation of Albanians nowadays in Greece, and a lot of them are trying to get away from agriculture and from the non-skilled jobs. So we had this issue around, but not we don't have child labor in Greek agriculture. Apart from the fact that we have some minors, people who come as refugees and they're underage, they're adolescents, and I mean younger than 18 years old. They say in many cases they're 15, 14, 15, 16, 17, not grown-ups in the sense that they've been in position to work, but they work together with other people from their own country in agricultural and non-agricultural jobs. And this is an issue which needs to be given more attention, I assume, because most of them do not declare their true age, or they underestimate or overestimate their age, depending on the cases. So this is a kind of agency, I would call it, or a way to get away from certain norms or certain rules. And we have people who are underaged and work in agriculture or other manual jobs, and this is not the thing we need to be. I mean, we have to prevent people from doing that. But there is a whole issue with a lot of them coming from Afghanistan and other countries from Africa, who are very young and shouldn't be allowed to work, but they are going to sometimes to work in the labor market. That's the only thing I wanted to mention in order to update the discussion.
Thank you, Deniz and Apostolos. We do have one more question so far. Please go ahead, Chisaki. I don't know if I'm pronouncing well your name, but please go ahead.
Yes, you're correct. Thank you very much. I'm assistant professor from Aga Khan University in Pakistan. It's very, very, very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. I have a question to Dr. Deniz. I was listening, very interesting about as I understand that the Syrian refugees in Turkey are mostly refugee Christian minority. Am I correct? And then it is So there is, I think, it's family that based on horticulture skill sets, and then also the family who is a smaller kids, and not because there's above 16 years old are not allowed to come into as a refugee with a family. So I mean that there is you mentioned about the intersectionality of the kind of treatments, and then I think it's aid they need, and I think it is very important to understand, as Dr. Apostolos has pointed out, it is very important to understand their situation, that's which is quite, I think is you can pinpoint about their needs and how very badly treated in residence, or if I can call the resident as a residence. So yes, those are important to understand skill sets and wages and requirement. So on NSCLE, I think this is a paper come from I can't remember which journal it is, but then Newcastle. Dr. Heidi Saxby's article in 2012, they're talking about Polish migrants, Eastern European migrants in Yorkshire. She talks about how religious church in rural community in Northeast is really helped the migrants' welfare. So I'd like to know, it might be just to kind of local culture based, but I'm sure that there is a conflict that we see that and everywhere in Syrian community between the Syrian community and the Kurdish, and then what is like the violence that is what you talked about. There's a kind of sudden violence that is like it's a real physical violence, and as opposed to the slow violence that is a mental. How they kind of I guess my question is how this kind of religious community that's what play role in the community.
Thank you for the question. Deniz, would you like to follow through?
And thank you very much for this question. It allows me to open another aspect of the situation. They are mostly Muslim, and their ethnic identity is usually Kurdish or Arabic. So it converts with the religious and ethnic identity of the other workers from Turkey. Like Kurdish workers, for example. There are also Arabic workers who are seasonal workers, but they are Turkish citizens. So they are all both Muslim. But when I look on the like relationship between the different groups of workers, I didn't observe solidarity. Instead of solidarity, there is usually conflict between the workers. When I visited a labor camp in Adana, I saw a distinct group of tents from the other tents in the same area. And I asked why those tents are located like quite far from the others, because this is only just one camp. But they said me there was a fight between Syrian refugees and Kurdish workers in a marriage ceremony, but with the guns. And after those fights, Syrian refugees removed their tents to a far place. And when I interview with the workers, like Kurdish workers, are usually complaining about the presence of Syrian refugees, because the presence of Syrian refugees are reducing the jobs and also wages, because they are working for lower wages. This is one reason. The other reason is they are with political. They are accusing them because of their political stance. They didn't fight for their country, but they flee from the war, something like this, more nationalistic discourse. And the third reason some of Syrian women become the second wife in some families, and those situations are spread over, and the other workers are saying, we are fearing from this situation, we don't want them because we may lose our husbands, etc. So there is, instead of solidarity based on religious and ethnic identity, I observe mostly conflict between different groups of workers.
Apostolos?
Yes, I think that the conflict is widespread. It's not an issue also in Turkey, but in other places in Greece. As far as I know, I cannot say more on Italy, but there are a lot of there are different types of conflicts and different hierarchies. And in the Greek case, you can imagine that there is also the issue between the locals and the non-locals, the migrants who come and work. And there is, I would say, a more covert or less covert fear of having people of another religion, especially in smaller rural areas, in less densely populated and more remote rural areas. So there is a conflict between, for example, different Asian migrants, and they don't work together. They don't collaborate. They work separately in different fields. And there is also this ethnic hierarchy between them, those who came earlier, the European so-called migrant laborers compared to the non-European ones. There's a different labor hierarchy there. So there are a lot of divisions among migrant laborers in rural areas, especially when they compete for specific day wage. We don't have so many labor camps. We don't have, like in the case of Turkey, this kind of rural ghettos, but we have some shanty towns in Manolada, in different places, especially more. But it's at the outskirts of the villages, and we have carefully charted them, and we are preparing some work related to that. Now we also see that a lot of migrant laborers move inside the village, and they are given houses. They're not all of them staying in tents or shanty housing. They are moving in the emptied houses. Of course, the cost of renting housing in rural areas is high, because although there isn't a large competition, the locals rent them for high rents, because it's kind of a different kind of exploitation. So we have different types of relations created or I would say reproduced in rural areas, and one should also see that aspect of the discussion: the use of water, the use of electricity, the use of housing, how these are distributed or rented out to migrant laborers, and it raises a large number of issues.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question and the answers too. We are just right now at the end time, but considering we started slightly late, I would give space to one quick question and answer more if there are any. I do myself have, yes, thank you so much. Yeah, Sonia, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for organizing this webinar, and thank you very much for the presenters for their contributions. I'm a PhD student at the Middle East Technical University, although I'm currently living in Spain, where I'm from. And I have a question. I don't know if it's a very broad question, But I mean, you have been talking about how migrant labor is considered as something seasonal. It's a very important concept you have developed. And I was wondering if you have examples of another context, apart from the Mediterranean context, in which this migrant labor in agriculture is not considered as seasonal, as if they are given, I don't know, with multiple entries, or given that they are living there, if they are given a permanent status, if they are given rights. Like, do you know any examples? And what do you think could be the policies in Greece or in Turkey for having these migrants having more rights while keeping them in the sector? Because I guess what keeps them in the sector and keeps the market labor cheap, which is in the interest of the producers, is this vulnerability. So what could be the way, or if you have an example of a balance which could be in interest of the migrants and also of the producers? I don't know if you can answer this question. Thank you very much.
Maybe we can, thank you for the question. Maybe we can start with Apostolos now, and then we close with Deniz this time.
A very interesting question. I said that I'm very careful in using the term seasonal labor because exactly of that, the thing you mentioned. They are considered vulnerable, and their vulnerability is considered a kind of disadvantage for them to stay in agriculture. And if we make this kind of reasoning, we will say, and in most cases, a lot of people say that they can survive by leaving agriculture and by leaving rural areas and going to somewhere and get a full-time job somewhere else. Whereas the issue is more complex. We have a lot of seasonal laborers coming as seasonal laborers and becoming more permanent in many cases, also in Greece, although they delay a lot to become permanent regulars. It might take 4 or 5 years. Or they use the refugee status to get a kind of recognition, so to say, in order to be able, once they get the recognition or the status, and then work as regulars. Only if they have a more secure position, which means not seasonal. And we have people who come as irregulars and they work in this seasonal work and they move around the country and end up in different places. So have a significant complexity around migrant labor in rural areas. That's why I think we have to go further, go to a higher, to have an overview of what is going on, and then see the different trajectories of people as different cases of people. And the idea, I think, is, and there's a lot of work to be done in that regard, is to keep people as regulars in agriculture and contribute to agriculture as better jobs, have a minimum wage at least, or secure a minimum wage, have better working conditions and employment conditions, and better living standards. But this is less the case nowadays. And that's why I ended up by saying we need to look at the bilateral agreements and see whether the bilateral agreements can be a way to better regulate the working conditions of the people who end up using these bilateral agreements, because it will be also a safe haven for them instead of coming irregularly, to help them for 6 or 9 months to have secure better paid jobs, and but being more generous in allowing to think further or to change employers, so to make the system more sustainable and the people more able to stay further if they like. So I think it has an opportunity for people to come in regularly and not as a prevention of people coming in into the country. So it's a different prioritization of this within the same discussion, in my opinion, what is needed.
Thank you, Deniz.
As far as I know from the literature, apart from the European context, in Mexico, there are slum neighborhoods that is distant from the villages, and economic migrants live permanently there in slums, in marginal neighborhoods. Yeah, apart from Europe, I know just Mexican example. But the Turkish case, the uniqueness of the Turkish case, I think, is the tent settlement, permanent tent settlement. But in Italy and Mexico, these are, as far as I understand from Apostolos, in Greece too, there are slum neighborhoods. Again, they can be called as rural ghetto. I think tent settlement is the uniqueness of the Turkish case.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for all the questions. And I think now it is time for us to close the session. I think it was a very rich session, a very rich webinar, both theory and empirical wise. Apostolos, Deniz, once again, thank you so much for the time. Once again, I would also like to say to the participants that I'm sorry for that initial technical sort of emergency that, Apostolos, you were kind enough to save us from that gridlock, and now we fortunately will have the access to the recording, which will be then shared to everybody to revisit or to watch for the first time the webinar. So thanks a lot for this.
Thank you so much for hosting us, for managing the discussion, and so much also the people who participated today. Nice to meet you, Deniz.
Thank you very much for this kind invitation. It was a pleasure for me to be here.
Hope to see you soon in other venues, preferably present in presence. Okay, thanks a lot. Have a nice day, a nice week, everybody, and see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.